The end of the era did not arrive with the thunder of artillery or the flash of a detonating missile. Instead, it arrived with the haunting, delicate strings of Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky. At 08 hours Moscow time, the frantic morning news feeds of the state-owned broadcasting giants Channel 1 and Russia 1 abruptly cut their signals. There was a flicker of static, a moment of digital hesitation, and then the image stabilized. It was a loop of four ballerinas, arms interlocked, moving in perfect synchronized precision across a stage. They were performing the dance of the little swans from Swan Lake. To the uninitiated observer in the West, it might have seemed like a technical glitch or a bizarre cultural interlude. But to anyone with a memory of Soviet history, the blood ran cold. In the Russian consciousness, Swan Lake is not merely a ballet, it is the ultimate harbinger of regime collapse. It was the footage played on loop during the death of Leonid Brezhnev in 1982. It was the only thing broadcast during the attempted hardline coup against Mikhail Gorbachev in August 1991. When the swans appear, it signals that the machinery of the state has broken. The king is incapacitated and the throne is empty. The immediate reaction on the ground was a suffocating confusion, a fog of war that descended not upon a battlefield, but upon the paved streets of the capital. For 2 decades, the Kremlin had cultivated an image of absolute, unshakable stability. The president was the state, and the state was the president. His schedule was broadcast with religious fervor. His directives were the heartbeat of the nation. Now there was only the ballet. The sudden disappearance of the president created an immediate, visceral vacuum. The paralysis of the state media was perhaps the most terrifying indicator of the severity of the crisis. The propaganda apparatus, usually a roaring engine of deflection and nationalist rhetoric, had simply ceased to function. The talk show hosts who defined reality for millions of citizens were absent. Their silence was louder than their shouting ever was. It suggested that the orders had stopped coming from the top, or worse, that there were conflicting orders coming from different factions, leaving the mouthpieces of the regime terrified to speak for fear of backing the losing side. Across Moscow, the digital age collided with this analog signal of doom. Social media platforms, usually aggressively scrubbed by censors, became a chaotic wash of rumors. Telegram channels exploded with unverified reports, armored personnel carriers moving down the Tarvskaya Street, the elite FSO guards sealing off the Kremlin walls, and the grounding of all flights from Vnukovo International Airport. Yet officially there was nothing. The government ministries were dark. The usually responsive press secretaries had vanished. The vertical of power constructed so painstakingly over 20 years appeared to have snapped. This domestic paralysis quickly metastasized into an international emergency. The world was not merely watching a government fall, it was witnessing the potential disintegration of the planet's largest nuclear power. Intelligence agencies from Langley to London scrambled to interpret the silence. The strategic angle was terrifying. A Russia with a dictator is a known threat. A Russia with no one in charge is a catastrophe. Who held the Chechid, the nuclear briefcase? If the chain of command had shattered, who controlled the silo keys? The silence from the Kremlin transformed into a global existential crisis. The fear wasn't just of a civil war, but of loose nukes and warlords vying for control over an arsenal capable of ending civilization. As the loop of the ballet played on into the afternoon, the psychological toll on the populace deepened. The normalcy of the morning commute clashed with the historical trauma of 1991. The citizens of Moscow realized that the special operation was no longer something happening in a distant land. The instability had come home. The illusion of safety purchased with political apathy had evaporated. However, regimes do not simply collapse for the sake of theater. The swans were dancing because the structure beneath them had rotted away, eaten by a war that was meant to be a triumph but became a tomb. The chaos in the capital was the final echo of a disaster that began hundreds of miles away, in the mud and ruin of the front lines. But to understand why the music is playing in Moscow today, we must look at the blood spilled in the Donbass yesterday. To understand the sudden silence that fell over Moscow, one had to first understand the deafening noise that had been tearing apart the Donbass for months. While the ballerinas danced on the screens of the capital, the reality on the front lines was a visceral nightmare of mud, shrapnel, and exhausted desperation. The collapse of the regime did not begin in a vacuum. It began in the trenches, born from a widening, fatal chasm between the political fantasies of the Kremlin and the bloody operational reality of the battlefield. For over a year, the strategy employed by the Russian high command had been grimly reductive, known colloquially among the troops as the meat grinder. It was a tactic devoid of nuance, relying on the sheer weight of human bodies to overwhelm fortified positions. Waves of mobilized soldiers, often poorly trained and ill-equipped, were thrown against entrenched defenses in catastrophic frontal assaults. The objective was rarely strategic innovation, but rather the desperate need to deliver tangible victories to the political leadership in Moscow. The Kremlin demanded arrows on a map to move forward, regardless of the cost and blood required to draw them. However, the military is a pragmatic institution, and the arithmetic of attrition is unforgiving. By the time the snows began to melt in early spring, the casualty rates had reached levels unseen since the Second World War. Entire battalions were being reconstituted, wiped out, and reconstituted again within the span of weeks. The professional corps of the army, the Kontrachniki, and the elite airborne units had been decimated early in the war, leaving a hollowed-out force held together by conscription and fear. This operational futility created a toxic friction between the men fighting the war and the men directing it from the gilded halls of the capital. The general staff found themselves in an impossible bind. They were being issued objectives that were militarily unachievable with the resources provided. When competent commanders attempted to voice this reality, requesting tactical withdrawals to save manpower or refusing to launch suicidal assaults, they were not listened to, they were purged. A revolving door of leadership saw the dismissal of generals who prioritized military logic over political optics. These dismissals were not merely administrative changes, they were insults to the officer corps. They sent a chilling message: loyalty to the president's delusion was more valuable than competence or the lives of soldiers. The fog of war was being thickened by a deliberate blindness at the top. The commanders who remained were sycophants, terrified of reporting bad news, which only compounded the disasters on the ground. The atmosphere within the military leadership began to eerily mirror the days preceding the 1991 Soviet collapse. Just as in August 1991, when the Soviet military was asked to turn its guns on its own people to save a dying communist party, the modern Russian army was being asked to destroy itself to save the reputation of a single man. In 1991, the coup plotters, the Gang of Eight, failed because the military refused to be the executioners for a bankrupt ideology. Now, decades later, a similar resentment was brewing. The officers realized they were the scapegoats in waiting. When the war inevitably failed, the Kremlin would not blame its own policy, it would blame the traitorous generals who failed to execute it. This realization transformed the army's despair into a hardened resolve. The military leadership understood that continuing the current trajectory was not just a professional failure, but a form of institutional suicide. They were being ground down against a wall of Western steel and Ukrainian resolve for political objectives that had long since evaporated. The denazification rhetoric meant nothing to a tank commander watching his column burn for the third time in a month. The disconnect was absolute. The Kremlin saw the war as an existential struggle for Russia's soul. The general staff saw it as the mathematical certainty of their own destruction. Silence, usually a sign of discipline in the ranks, transformed into a mask for conspiracy. The grumbling in the mess hall stopped, replaced by knowing glances and encrypted communications. The army was no longer fighting the enemy in front of them with the same ferocity. They were looking over their shoulders at the enemy behind them. They realized that to save the army, they might have to sacrifice the regime. The simmering anger among the general staff was a powder keg, and the match was lit not on the front lines, but in the corridors of the Lubyanka. The simmering anger of the general staff had found a common frequency with the cold pragmatism of the Lubyanka. While the world focused on the stalemate in the Donbass, the true pivot of history occurred in a secure, lead-lined room beneath Moscow. It was here that the unthinkable alliance was forged. The operation, codenamed Iron Curtain, was not a spontaneous uprising, but a masterpiece of bureaucratic sabotage turned lethal. The architects were a triumvirate of necessity: General Belosov representing the disillusioned military, Alexander Bortnikov, the cynical head of the FSB who saw the war eroding state stability, and Viktor Zolotov, commander of the National Guard Rosgvardia, whose loyalty had finally been purchased by the promise of survival. Their goal was precise: a textbook palace coup designed to decapitate the leadership without shattering the fragile vessel of the state. The timing was impeccable. 03 hours on a Tuesday, the president was at his Novo Ogariovo residence, a fortress of solitude, that had paradoxically become his cage. The coup plotters did not storm the gates with tanks. Such a spectacle would have panicked the public and the international markets. Instead, they weaponized the very security protocols designed to protect the president. Bortnikov played the first card. Using his authority over internal communications, the FSB initiated a Level 1 cyber isolation protocol. Ostensibly, this was a drill to protect the Kremlin's network from a detected NATO cyber attack. In reality, it was a digital siege. In an instant, the secure lines linking Novo Ogariovo to the Ministry of Defense, the nuclear command centers, and the regional governors went dead. The president's digital lifeline to the outside world was severed, leaving him shouting into a void of static. Simultaneously, the physical cordon was tightened. General Balasov had quietly replaced the outer ring of the president's security detail, usually drawn from the elite presidential regiment, with hand-picked Spetsnaz units loyal to the plotters. These men were briefed that a foreign infiltration team was targeting the residence, necessitating a total lockdown. The inner circle of the president's personal bodyguards, the FSO, found themselves outnumbered and outgunned by the very reinforcements they had been told were coming to assist them. The crucial element, however, was Zolotov's National Guard. His troops were the Praetorian Guard of the regime, specifically trained to put down internal dissent. By bringing Zolotov into the fold, the plotters ensured that the only force capable of rushing to the president's aid was instead ordered to stand down. Zolotov issued a red alert confined to barracks order for all Moscow-based Rosgvardiya units, citing imminent terrorist threats. This kept the streets clear and prevented loyalist factions from mobilizing a counterforce. At 0345, the delegation arrived at Novo Ogariovo. It was not an assault team, but a group of high-ranking officers in dress uniforms, led by Bolasov himself. They were admitted through the gates under the guise of an emergency briefing regarding a nuclear escalation on the front. When they entered the president's private quarters, the pretense evaporated. There was no shootout. The reality of the coup was far more bureaucratic and chilling. The president was informed that due to health reasons, he was being relieved of command. He was not killed. Martyrdom was too dangerous a variable, but he was detained, his communications stripped, his staff arrested or co-opted. The efficiency of the operation was terrifying. In less than an hour, the man who had ruled Russia for 2 decades had been reduced from a czar to a prisoner in his own home. The nuclear briefcase, the Cheget, was secured by Bolasov's aides, ensuring that the ultimate lever of power was now in the hands of the junta. It was a surgical removal of the head of state, executed with such silence that the guards at the Kremlin walls in central Moscow didn't even know their master had fallen until the sun rose. By dawn, the triumvirate controlled the physical person of the president, the nuclear codes, and the primary communication nodes. They had achieved the impossible, a change of power in a nuclear superpower, without firing a single shot in anger. But as the adrenaline of the night faded, the cold light of day revealed the magnitude of their gamble. They had seized the throne, but the kingdom was still waking up. The silence they had imposed was fragile. The president was isolated, but removing the head of the snake was the easy part. Controlling the venomous body that remained was the true challenge. As the initial shock of the midnight operation faded, a deeper, colder realization settled over the geopolitical landscape. The world was not witnessing a revolution of the people, but a structural collapse of a specific method of governance. To understand the gravity of this moment, one must look beyond the personalities involved and examine the architecture of the state itself. What happened in the early hours of the morning was the catastrophic failure of the vertical of power, the singular pillar upon which the entire Russian Federation had rested for 20 years. This vertical was a construct of deceptive simplicity. It was designed to bypass the messy inefficiencies of democracy and bureaucracy, creating a direct line of command from the president's desk to the furthest reaches of the provinces. In theory, it was a monolith of strength. In practice, as exposed by the brutal stress test of war, it was a brittle hierarchy built on the quicksand of personal loyalty rather than the bedrock of institutional competence. For 2 decades, the currency of the Kremlin was not merit but fealty. Governors, generals, and ministers were selected not for their ability to govern or command, but for their willingness to nod. This system functioned adequately during times of peace and economic surplus, where oil revenues could grease the gears and mask inefficiencies. However, modern high-intensity warfare is the ultimate auditor of state capacity. It does not care about loyalty. It cares about logistics, morale, and industrial output. When the war in Ukraine demanded competence, the vertical of power could only offer corruption and sycophancy. The failure was systemic. The information that flowed up the vertical was distorted at every level. Colonels lied to generals to avoid reprimand. Generals lied to ministers to keep their budgets, and ministers lied to the president to keep their heads. The result was a leadership completely divorced from reality, issuing orders to phantom tank divisions that existed only on paper. The meat grinder on the front lines was the direct physical manifestation of this administrative rot. The soldiers died not because of enemy superiority, but because the system prioritized the president's political comfort over the hard truths of operational necessity. When the military and security services, the Siloviki, finally moved, it was because the social contract of the elite had shattered. The implicit deal had always been simple. The leader provides stability and wealth, and the elites provide unquestioning loyalty. But when the leader began to offer only isolation, sanctions, and the destruction of the army, the calculation changed. The loyalty evaporated because the returns on that loyalty had become negative. The system did not possess the institutional strength to correct itself through elections or debate. Therefore, it had to correct itself through a coup. Crucially, Western observers, hoping that this collapse signals a dawn of liberal democracy, are misreading the room entirely. This is not a pivot toward freedom. It is a retreat into a hardened national salvation. The men who seized the Cheget, Briefcase, Balasov, Bortnikov, and Zolotov are not Democrats. They are creatures of the deep state. They view the previous leadership not as too authoritarian, but as too incompetent. Their objective is not to dismantle the Russian Empire, but to save it from the suicide pact the previous president had signed. This new governing body, likely to style itself as a Committee of National Salvation, represents a shift toward a more militaristic, streamlined, and perhaps even more ruthless form of governance. They argue that the previous regime failed because it was corrupted by luxury and detached from the martial reality. Their solution will likely be a total mobilization of the economy and society, stripped of the pretense of normalcy the previous administration tried to maintain. They are realists who understand that the current war trajectory is fatal, yet they cannot simply surrender. They are seeking a way to freeze the conflict, rebuild the shattered military, and secure the state's borders. The vertical of power has been replaced by a horizontal table of warlords. The danger has shifted from the whims of one isolated man to the collective paranoia of a junta. While the singular autocrat is gone, the vacuum he left is being filled by a fragile coalition of competing interests, united only by the fear of total defeat. We have replaced a single autocrat with a committee of desperate men, and history tells us that desperate men make dangerous calculations. The silence that had gripped Moscow's airwaves was finally broken at 10 a.m. The broadcast did not feature the familiar face of the president, nor the slick graphics of modern Russian news. Instead, the screen showed an austere table draped in heavy green cloth, behind which sat 5 unsmiling men. In the center was General Balasov. This was the debut of the State Committee for National Salvation, SCNS, a body that consciously mirrored the aesthetics of the 1991 Gang of Eight, but with a far more lethal intent. Balasov spoke with the clipped, emotionless cadence of a field report. He announced that the former president had been temporarily relieved of his duties due to a catastrophic loss of confidence and critical health failures. The Constitution was suspended. Martial law was declared in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and the regions bordering Ukraine. But the most chilling detail lay in the subtext. This was not a peace mission. The committee accused the former administration not of starting the war, but of failing to win it. They cited criminal negligence and treasonous corruption within the Ministry of Defense, signaling a purge that would see thousands of loyalists arrested by nightfall. The economic reaction was instantaneous and violent. Before the broadcast had even concluded, the Moscow Exchange MOX plummeted. In a desperate bid to stem the bleeding, the central bank ordered a total freeze on all trading, indefinitely shuttering the stock market. The ruble evaporated in street-level trading, with black market exchanges popping up instantly on Telegram, offering rates 3 times higher than the official peg. Oligarchs, sensing the shift in tectonic plates, scrambled to flee. Private jets fueled up at Vnukovo were grounded by military trucks parked on the runways. The committee knew that to control the state, they first had to secure the capital, both its money and its men. However, the true source of global panic was not the stock market. It was the Chegit. Intelligence reports filtering into Washington and Brussels suggested a terrifying uncertainty regarding the nuclear chain of command. While Belousov physically possessed the president's nuclear briefcase, the Russian nuclear triad operates on the Kazbek system, which traditionally requires triple key authorization: the president, the minister of defense, and the chief of the general staff. In the chaos of the coup, the chief of the general staff, a loyalist to the old regime, had gone missing. He was rumored to be in a bunker in the Urals, potentially with the ability to countermand or block launch orders. This created a split-key scenario where the arsenal was technically paralyzed. The risk wasn't an immediate launch, but rather that a rogue commander in a silo, confused by conflicting orders from Moscow and the Urals, might bypass the electronic locks entirely. The SCNS was frantically trying to rekey the system, sending Spetsnaz teams to physically secure the command nodes of the strategic rocket forces. This internal paralysis forced the committee into a dangerous corner. To project strength and prevent a counter-coup by loyalist factions, they needed to escalate the external conflict. They could not afford to look weak. Intelligence analysts began to wargame three distinct scenarios for the coming days. Scenario A, the fortress strategy. The committee announces a total mobilization, closing the borders and transitioning the economy to a full war footing. They abandon the special military operation euphemism and declare a patriotic war against NATO, hoping to rally the population around the flag. Scenario B, the nuclear blackmail. Failing to stabilize the front lines with conventional forces, the committee authorizes a demonstration strike, a tactical nuclear detonation over the Black Sea or an uninhabited area of Ukraine, to force the West into immediate negotiations on Russian terms. Scenario C, fragmentation. The coup fails to consolidate power. Regional governors in resource-rich areas like Tatarstan or Yakutia, seeing the weakness in Moscow, refuse to send tax revenue or conscripts. The Federation begins to fracture, creating a civil war with nuclear weapons scattered across the belligerents. For the moment, the committee chose Scenario A. They announced treason charges against the traitors who had mismanaged the war, executing a public pivot to hardline nationalism. But the cracks were already visible. The streets of Moscow were quiet, but it was the silence of a held breath, not of submission. The SCNS had seized the levers of power, but they were pulling on wires that were disconnected or frayed. They were commanders without an obedient army and treasurers of a bankrupt vault. While the generals argue over the nuclear codes in Moscow, the shockwaves are already crashing against the shores of the global economy. While the generals in Moscow were locked in a deadly struggle for the nuclear codes, the shockwaves of their actions were already crashing against the shores of the global economy with the force of a tsunami. The illusion that a coup in the world's largest country could be contained within its own borders evaporated instantly. The tremors were felt not in Richter scales, but in the frantic, flashing red numbers of global indices. By midday European time, the energy markets were in freefall, or rather a terrified ascent. The uncertainty surrounding Russian energy exports caused Brent crude to spike by 20% in a single hour, a surge not seen since the shocks of the 1970s. Natural gas futures in Rotterdam followed suit, threatening to strangle European industry just as it was recovering from the previous winter. The Committee of National Salvation had not yet turned off the taps, but the traders assumed the worst, that energy would become the primary weapon of the new junta, or that the pipelines themselves would become casualties of a brewing civil war. In Beijing, the mood was one of suppressed fury and acute strategic anxiety. For years, China had bet heavily on Russia as its stable junior partner in the contest against American hegemony. They had counted on a predictable authoritarian neighbor to secure their northern flank and provide cheap resources. Now, looking at the chaos unfolding in Moscow, the Chinese leadership realized they were tethered to a sinking ship. Zhongnanhai, the headquarters of the Chinese Communist Party, went into emergency session. The fear was not just economic, it was territorial. A destabilized Russia meant a porous 4,200-kilometer border. If the Russian Federation fractured, the resulting vacuum in Central Asia would threaten China's Belt and Road Initiative and potentially spill Islamic extremism into Xinjiang. Beijing immediately ordered the People's Liberation Army (PLA) Northern Theater Command to a state of high readiness. They weren't preparing to invade, but to seal the border hermetically against a potential flood of refugees or rogue military units thousands of miles away in Brussels. NATO ambassadors gathered for an emergency session that was defined by a terrifying lack of intelligence. The alliance was built to fight a unified Soviet threat, not to manage the disintegration of a nuclear superpower. The fog of war had blinded Western satellites, with the Russian internet severed, and the American assets in Moscow largely dark. NATO was flying blind. The discussions were frantic. Was this a genuine coup or a maskirovka, a deception designed to lure the West into a trap? The greatest fear was loose nukes. If the Russian chain of command broke down completely, who would secure the tactical warheads stored in forward bases near NATO borders? The nightmare scenario of a proliferation bazaar where warlords sold nuclear material to the highest bidder was suddenly a plausible reality. Inside Russia, the geopolitical abstraction translated into immediate human misery. The social contract, that unwritten agreement where the population traded political freedom for stability, was shredded. The ruble did not just fall, it ceased to be a functioning currency. As the Moscow exchange remained frozen, street-level inflation hit hyperinflationary speeds. A loaf of bread that cost 50 rubles in the morning cost 300 by evening. The ATMs were drained within hours, leaving millions with worthless plastic cards. Panic buying stripped the shelves of Moscow's supermarkets. It wasn't just luxury goods vanishing, it was basics like buckwheat, sugar, and canned meat. The veneer of a modern European-style consumer society was stripped away, revealing the terrified Soviet survival instincts beneath. The committee responded with the clumsy hammer of martial law. Curfews were imposed at sundown. The flashing lights of police cruisers replaced the bustle of nightlife. Reports surfaced of men of military age being detained at metro stations, not for crimes, but for immediate conscription into the new National Salvation Battalions. The strategic reality was stark. A massive vacuum had opened in the heart of Eurasia. Neither Washington nor Beijing was prepared to fill it. The world had spent decades fearing a strong Russia, but now realized that a weak, collapsing Russia was infinitely more dangerous. The stabilizing gravity of the Kremlin was gone, leaving the vast expanse from St. Petersburg to Vladivostok to spin into chaotic orbit. The global powers watched with bated breath, knowing that the outcome of this power struggle would define the security architecture of the 21st century. The markets will recover, and the borders may hold, but the illusion of stability in the East has been shattered forever. As the initial tremors of the Moscow coup begin to subside, the world finds itself standing not at the end of a crisis, but at the precipice of a far more terrifying reality. The silence of the first morning has been replaced by the cacophony of a geopolitical order, fracturing in real time. The removal of the president was intended to be a surgical strike, a clean excision of a cancerous tumor to save the body of the state. Instead, the Committee of National Salvation has discovered that the cancer had metastasized long ago, infecting the very marrow of the Russian Federation. We are now living under the sword of Damocles. In the ancient Greek parable, the sword hung by a single horsehair to demonstrate the perpetual peril of those in power. Today, that sword hangs over the entire globe, suspended by the fraying thread of a broken nuclear chain of command. The strategic reality has shifted fundamentally. For decades, the West planned for a conflict with a monolithic, aggressive Russia, a peer competitor with a centralized brain. That enemy is gone. In its place is something infinitely more volatile, a wounded, cornered animal, lashing out in the blindness of its own agony. The danger of this wounded bear cannot be overstated. A strong dictator has red lines. They have a survival instinct and a desire to maintain their legacy. A collapsing junta has no such inhibitions. The men now sitting at the long table in the Kremlin, Borisov, Bortnikov, and the rest, are fighting for their literal lives. They know that if they lose control, they will not be exiled to comfortable dakhas. They will be executed. This desperation changes the calculus of deterrence. Rational actor models, the foundation of Cold War stability, no longer apply. When a regime believes it is already dead, it has no reason not to take the rest of the world down with it. The internal chaos radiating from Moscow makes Russia more unpredictable, not less. We are witnessing the privatization of violence. As the central authority weakens, the monopoly on force is dissolving. Warlords, mercenary groups, and regional governors are hoarding weapons and resources, creating a patchwork of fiefdoms armed with heavy artillery. The risk is no longer just a strategic nuclear exchange ordered by the Kremlin. It is the tactical use of a loose warhead by a rogue commander seeking leverage against a rival faction. The vertical of power has crashed, and in the debris, 1,000 smaller tyrants are rising. This brings us to the uncomfortable truth that Western policymakers are hesitant to admit. For years, the strategic objective of NATO was the weakening of the Russian state. That objective has been achieved, and it is a catastrophe. The collapse has created a black hole in the center of Eurasia, a security vacuum that pulls in every neighboring power from Poland to China into a vortex of instability. There is no plan for this. There is no roadmap for managing the disintegration of a country spanning 11 time zones and possessing 6,000 nuclear warheads. We have kicked down the door of the structure only to find that the roof is collapsing on our heads. So as we watch the tanks patrol the Red Square and the markets shudder, I must ask you, the reader, to confront the central paradox of our time. We spent generations fearing Russian strength, building alliances and arsenals to contain it.